The wind howled like a wounded animal, gnashing its teeth at the weary world. The snow whipped across the land, its frigid bite cutting through every crack in the earth. It was late afternoon, the sky a bruised violet, and the low sun threatened to vanish behind the dark, craggy hills. He rode with his head bent, eyes squinting against the biting cold, the reins tight in his rough, calloused hands. Every breath he drew came out as a puff of steam in the icy air. The horse beneath him moved steadily, its hooves crunching through the deepening snow, but it seemed like the whole world was frozen in place, silent, lonely. And then there was the cry. It came from somewhere ahead, thin and desperate, a sound that cut through the howling wind like a knife. It stopped him cold. He pulled on the reins, slowing the horse to a halt. The cry was unmistakable, a woman's voice, full of pain, full of grief. He looked ahead, his heart thudding in his chest. Nothing but snow and wind, no sign of life, no signs of civilization. The cry came again, this time more distinct. A broken sob, high-pitched and raw, the sound of someone who had given up on their dignity, their pride, and was now lost in a storm of despair. He cursed softly under his breath. There wasn't supposed to be anyone out here. Not in this cold, not in this weather. He shifted in the saddle, his boots scraping against the stirrups as he glanced behind him, contemplating the quiet path he had been following. The world stretched out like an endless blanket of white, but that cry, it gnawed at him. He clicked his tongue, urging the horse forward toward the sound. And as they moved through the swirling flurries, the silhouette of a woman emerged from the snow, crouched low, her face buried in her hands. Her body was hunched, small and frail against the vast expanse of white that stretched for miles in every direction. She didn't see him at first. She didn't hear him either. The snow had swallowed up everything but the sound of her sobbing. He tugged at the reins, bringing the horse to a slow, careful stop a few paces away. His hand instinctively went to the rifle on his saddle, but he didn't reach for it. Instead, he just sat there, staring down at the woman, unsure of what to do. His heart tightened, but his mind was colder than the landscape surrounding him. "Ma'am," he called, his voice rough from disuse, barely louder than a whisper above the wind. She didn't answer, not at first. The air seemed to hold its breath as he waited. His fingers twitched on the reins, but his eyes stayed locked on the woman, her sobs breaking through the silence. Then she lifted her head slowly, just enough for him to see the red streaks running down her cheeks. Her eyes were hollow, sunken from days, maybe weeks, of suffering. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but the words got lost somewhere in her throat. Then, in a voice so small it felt like the world might swallow it, she said, "Please help me." What could he do? Should he just turn around and leave her to whatever fate had brought her to this forsaken place? This was no place for a man like him. But there was something about the way she looked, something in her eyes that made him hesitate, made him question whether he could just leave her behind. The woman, broken and trembling, looked at him, as if she knew he was her only hope. The wind began to howl louder, and the sky darkened even more. Something deep inside him twisted. A crack of something, a feeling he hadn't had in years, began to surface. He didn't know why he was stopping, but he couldn't just ride past her. Not now. He dismounted slowly, the crunch of his boots in the snow harsh against the otherwise still world. His hands ached from the cold, but he ignored it as he stepped closer to the woman. Her gaze met his, raw and desperate, and for a moment it was as if the rest of the world disappeared. Her clothes were torn, her body bruised beneath the layers of snow and ice. A dark stain spread across the front of her coat, and he could see the way her hands trembled, though she was trying to hide it. She looked like someone who had been running for too long, trying to escape something or someone, only to find herself stranded in the unforgiving wilderness. He kneeled beside her, the snow seeping through his trousers, but he hardly noticed. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound of it drowning out the wind. "You're hurt," he said quietly, his voice gentle. He reached out instinctively, his fingers brushing against her arm, but she flinched back, her wide, fearful eyes darting to his hand before she looked away. "I'm fine," she whispered, though the way she winced spoke otherwise. Her voice cracked, like a fragile thread about to snap. He studied her face for a moment, trying to gauge her, trying to understand her story. But there were no answers to be found in her bloodshot eyes, or in the brokenness of her posture. "Why are you out here?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "Where's your camp?" She hesitated, her lips trembling as she swallowed hard. I had nowhere to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. They took everything. My name, my life, my family." She paused, her face tightening as she fought to keep her composure. "I tried to run, but I couldn't." He didn't need more. He could hear the pain in her voice, the story of betrayal, of being cast aside, of being treated like a ghost. He had seen it before in the eyes of men who had been wronged, in the hollow look of a soldier who had lost his reason for fighting. But never had he seen it so raw, so absolute, in a woman's face. He was quiet for a long while. His instincts told him to move, to leave her. But the way she looked at him, with that desperate trust in her eyes, it gnawed at him. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost tender. "Evelyn," she replied, the name slipping from her lips like a prayer. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of something distant, perhaps danger, perhaps nothing at all. The world felt heavy, as though the weight of the snow and the cold was pressing down on them both. His mind raced, wondering what had brought her to this moment. What had made her believe she was beyond saving? "You don't need to be alone," he said, his voice rough with a promise he didn't quite understand. "You can come with me." Her eyes flickered, uncertainty clouding her gaze, but her trembling hands slowly reached for him. She didn't say anything in return, but in the silence between them, the world seemed to hold its breath. He extended his arm, offering a hand, not just to pull her up from the cold snow, but to pull her from whatever torment had driven her this far into the wilderness. The wind howled again, but it felt softer now, as if the storm was quieting in response to the small, fragile bond that had begun to form between them. She hesitated for a moment longer before her cold, bruised fingers slipped into his. The touch was weak, but it was enough. Her grip was full of silent gratitude, though she didn't speak it. She didn't need to. Together they rose, and he helped her onto the back of his horse, his rough hand steady on her waist. He settled behind her, feeling the chill of her skin against his jacket. The wind no longer seemed as harsh as it had before. With a deep breath, he urged the horse forward, its hooves crunching through the snow as they began to move toward the distant hills. The mountains loomed ahead, silent and cold, but in the quiet moments between them, something stirred, something unspoken. The long ride ahead was going to be hard, and the world would remain as unforgiving as it had always been. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he knew that he wasn't just a man passing through. He was going to stand by her, somehow. They rode together in silence, the crunch of hooves the only sound for miles, the world spinning around them. Neither spoke, but in that shared space, there was something more than the wind and the cold. There was a bond forged, not in words, but in the silence between them. A bond that neither of them fully understood yet. The journey felt endless. The snow underfoot deepened, turning the trail into a slow, treacherous path. Evelyn sat stiff against him, her back tense, her face pale, beneath the layers of frost clinging to her hair. The wind had grown bitter as night fell, and the cold seemed to seep deeper into their bones. He didn't know where they were headed, or even if the town he'd passed days ago was still standing. But there was one thing he knew for sure. She wasn't going to make it if they didn't find shelter soon. Her trembling form, the way she kept her head low, avoiding his gaze. He could tell she was carrying a weight heavier than any snowdrift. She didn't speak as they made their way through the darkening landscape. Her silence was an answer in itself. There was something about her that told him she wasn't just running from the cold or the storm. She was running from something far darker. He didn't press her for answers, though. It wasn't time. She would speak when she was ready. Eventually, the shadow of a small cabin appeared on the horizon, barely visible against the whitewashed world. The lights inside flickered dimly. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. He urged the horse forward, his hand steady on Evelyn's back as he helped her dismount. She winced slightly when her feet hit the ground, her body stiff with exhaustion. He could see it in her posture, the weight of whatever had happened to her, the toll it had taken on her spirit. The cabin was small and humble. He had seen many like it, places where men tried to forget their pasts, tried to make a life on the edge of nowhere. The door creaked open as they entered, and the warmth of the fire inside met them like an old friend. He led her to a small cot in the corner, her movements hesitant, almost as though she feared someone might come in and take it all away from her again. He didn't press her to speak yet. He went about his business, gathering wood for the fire, tending to the horse, doing what needed to be done. She sat in the corner, her hands curled tightly in her lap, the faintest tremor still running through her. He could tell she was exhausted, but there was something else in her eyes now. Something raw, a deep pain that hadn't been there before. When the fire was burning bright enough to cast shadows across the room, he turned back to her. She hadn't moved, but her eyes were fixed on the flames, distant and far away. "You can rest now," he said, his voice low. "You're safe here." She didn't respond, and for a moment he thought she hadn't heard him. But then her voice came, soft and fragile. "You don't know what they did to me," she whispered. His heart clenched at the words, but he didn't ask her to elaborate. She wasn't ready to speak of it yet. "You're not alone now," he said gently, sitting down next to her. "Whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone anymore." Her shoulders trembled as she looked up at him, the tears in her eyes making the light of the fire dance with unshed grief. And then something shifted. Her lips parted, and the words came in a rush, almost like she couldn't hold them back any longer. "They branded me," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as though the act itself had stolen her strength. "They called me a witch, said I was cursed. They burned the mark into my skin, made sure the world would always know I was the one who deserved punishment." Her hand trembled as she pulled at the edge of her coat, revealing the faded scar across her left shoulder. The brand. It was a jagged symbol, crude and ugly, like something that had been carved into her flesh by men who had no understanding of the cruelty they wielded. A circle with a crude line drawn through it, a symbol of shame, of punishment. She turned her gaze away, as if she couldn't bear the sight of the scar anymore. The air between them grew heavy, thick with the weight of her words. He could see it now, the deep-seated hurt in her eyes. She wasn't just broken. She was marked. The world had taken its toll on her, and there was no escaping it. He reached out then, slowly, cautiously, his fingers brushing against the scar on her skin. The touch was gentle, more of a reassurance than anything else. He didn't speak for a long while, just held her gaze with the kind of quiet understanding that comes only when you've seen the darkness in the world and know it's not enough to turn away from it. "You can bury it," he said quietly, his voice rough with the weight of his own unspoken past. "You can bury it all, Evelyn. You're not that mark. You're more than what they did to you." Her breath hitched at his words, and for a brief moment he saw something in her eyes, a flicker of hope, fragile and fleeting, like the first signs of dawn. But just as quickly, it was gone, and she looked away again. She didn't need to hear him say more. She knew that it was up to her now. She could choose to let the mark define her, or she could bury it, bury the past, and start again. She could still live. She could still be free. And somewhere deep inside, he knew this moment was a turning point. She was still broken, but there was a strength in her, a quiet, defiant strength that hadn't been extinguished, even after everything. The days that followed were quiet. The silence between them as thick as the snow that still blanketed the land outside. The storm had passed, but the cold was unrelenting, seeping into everything, even the warmth of the cabin. But inside there was a certain peace that hadn't been there before. Evelyn seemed to settle into the rhythm of survival. No longer a woman on the run, but a woman who had found something to hold on to, even if it was just a semblance of safety. He didn't ask her to tell him more about her past. He knew she wasn't ready. She spent her days at the small wooden table, her hands busy with needle and thread, mending the clothes that had once been her only protection. He would occasionally catch glimpses of her working, her brow furrowed in concentration, her eyes distant as if she was lost in the motions, trying to forget whatever demons lurked in her memory. But there was one evening, just before dusk, when it all changed. He had stepped outside to tend to the horse, his boots crunching in the snow, when he heard it. A voice, a small voice, trembling with both fear and defiance. It was coming from the direction of the town, where the dim lights of the old saloon flickered in the distance. He squinted against the dying light, his heart hammering in his chest. He wasn't sure at first, but then he heard it again. A cry, loud and clear, a voice calling out into the emptiness. Evelyn. She was standing at the edge of the cabin, staring out into the distance. Her body was tense, her posture rigid, as though she was trying to fight against something invisible. He walked up behind her slowly, unsure of what was happening. "What is it?" he asked softly, but she didn't answer right away. She just stood there, her chest rising and falling rapidly with each breath, her fists clenched at her sides. "They're coming," she whispered, almost too quietly to hear. He frowned, trying to understand. "Who's coming?" "The men who did this to me, the ones who marked me," she said, her voice barely audible, but laced with something he hadn't heard before, something fierce, something that had been buried deep inside her for far too long. "They've found me. They always find me." His mind raced, trying to piece together what she meant. "We can leave, Evelyn. We can keep moving. We don't have to face them." She turned then, her eyes wide with fear, but there was something else in them, something raw, something desperate. "You don't understand. They took everything. My family, my life, my name. And now they think they can take me again." Her voice broke slightly, but it was clear now she wasn't just afraid. She was angry. Angry at the injustice. Angry at the way the world had treated her. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against her arm, the touch tender but firm. "You don't have to face them alone. You've got me now." But she pulled away sharply, her eyes flashing with something new. "No, I'm not running anymore," she said, her voice stronger now, the words coming with a clarity he hadn't expected. "I'm not hiding anymore." She reached for the small bundle of her belongings, where she'd been keeping the few things she had left. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small rusted knife, its edge worn from use. It was a simple thing, but in that moment, it felt like a symbol of everything she had left. "They can come," she said, her voice a little steadier now, as she held the knife in her hand. "But they'll have to come through me first." The quiet defiance in her words hit him like a thunderclap. He'd seen men like this. Men who had nothing left but the will to survive, to keep going no matter the cost. But this was different. This was a woman who had been torn apart, who had been broken by the world, and yet she was standing tall, ready to face whatever came next. He didn't say anything at first. There was no need for words. The fire between them had been kindled, and it burned brighter now than it ever had before. He didn't take the knife from her, but he stood by her side, his hand resting on his revolver. He didn't need to say anything. His presence was enough. She wasn't alone anymore. The sound of footsteps in the snow reached them just then, slow and deliberate, like the thrum of a distant drum. The men were coming, and they would find that Evelyn was not the woman they remembered. Evelyn took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling as she glanced toward the door. There was no turning back now. The past had come for her, but she was no longer the frightened woman who had run. She was something else, something that the world had tried to crush, but instead, it had made her stronger. The men would find that there was more to her than they had ever known. The cold wind howled outside, rattling the wooden walls of the cabin, but inside, a different kind of storm was brewing. Evelyn stood by the door, her hand steady on the small knife, the pale light of the fire flickering behind her like a soft halo. He stood beside her, his own revolver resting lightly in his grip, his stance calm but alert. There was no fear in his eyes, only the deep understanding that some battles weren't fought with bullets, but with resolve. The footsteps grew louder, crunching through the snow, steady and unyielding. He could hear the gruff voices of the men, though they were still too far to make out the words. Evelyn's gaze never left the door. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, but her hands didn't shake. There was a quiet strength in her now, one that had been buried for so long, but had finally surfaced, like the first signs of a new dawn. "They'll want you," he said quietly, his voice low but firm. "But they won't get you." She nodded once, her jaw set, her eyes hard like the snow outside. "No," she whispered, "they'll never get me again." And then, as if to answer her defiance, the door opened with a creak, and the men stepped inside, their silhouettes dark against the snow behind them. There were 4 of them, tall, broad-shouldered, with rough, weathered faces. Their eyes flicked around the cabin, landing on Evelyn first, their gazes hard and unforgiving. One of them, the tallest, stepped forward. His voice was low and grating. "There you are! We've been looking for you, girl." Evelyn didn't flinch. She stood tall, the small knife still held loosely in her hand. The fire crackled behind her, casting shadows across her face, but there was no fear in her eyes, only the faintest glimmer of something else, something defiant, something unbroken. "You're not going to take me," she said, her voice calm, but there was a fire in it now, a conviction that burned brighter than the flames behind her. "Not now, not ever again." The men chuckled, a low, mocking sound, but it didn't reach Evelyn. She didn't move, didn't let them see the tremble in her hands, the way her heart was pounding in her chest. She was ready, and she knew this was the moment. This was when she would choose who she would become, and nothing could take that away. The tall man took another step forward, his hand reaching for the holster at his side. "You've got guts, I'll give you that, but you don't stand a chance. You're outnumbered." Evelyn's gaze never wavered. "I'm not outnumbered," she said, her voice steady. "Not anymore." Before the man could make a move, he paused. His hand hovered above his gun, his eyes flickering to the cowboy standing beside her. There was something in his gaze, something that made the air tense with unspoken understanding. The man's hand lowered slowly, the tension in the room palpable. Evelyn's protector didn't speak. His eyes locked with the tall man's for a moment, and then he turned to look at Evelyn. He didn't need to say anything. She knew. They were in this together now, and whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The men hesitated. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, until the tall man let out a sharp breath and took a step back. The others followed suit, their eyes still on Evelyn, but no longer with the same aggression. There was a shift in the air, a quiet understanding that hadn't been there before. The woman they had come to claim was not the same woman who had fled. She was no longer a victim. "You've made your point, girl," the tall man said, his voice gruff. "We'll let you be. For now." Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't need to. They were leaving, and they were taking nothing with them. As the men turned to leave, their footsteps crunching in the snow, Evelyn's eyes stayed on them. She didn't feel triumph. There was no grand victory, no dramatic moment. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about standing her ground, about refusing to be broken any longer. When the door closed behind them, the silence in the cabin was overwhelming. Evelyn stood there for a moment, her body trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the release of tension, from the knowing that she had chosen her path, and the world had no power to take that from her. The cowboy stepped toward her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. There was no need for words now. She wasn't alone anymore. He had been her protector, her strength, but it was she who had found her own. "I won't ever let them take you," he said quietly, his voice full of a promise she didn't need to hear again. She had heard it in his actions, in the way he had stood beside her when the world tried to break her. Evelyn nodded, her face softening, the weight of the brand on her shoulder feeling just a little lighter. "They can try," she said, her voice steady, "but I'm not who I was anymore." The fire crackled behind them, casting long shadows on the walls. The world outside was cold, the night dark and uncertain, but inside there was warmth now. There was peace. As the night stretched on, Evelyn sat by the fire, her eyes distant but no longer lost. The road ahead was long, and the past would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. She had faced the storm, and she had survived. And as the embers burned low, she knew that her life had been changed in a way she couldn't explain, not by the men who had marked her, but by the quiet strength she had discovered in herself. A life reclaimed, a brand buried, never to be seen again. The fire crackles softly, and the night stretches on. In the silence, there's a question, one that lingers, unanswered. How many of us are marked by the past, and how many of us are brave enough to bury it? If Evelyn's story of survival, strength, and defiance resonated with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Join us on this journey where we uncover more tales of resilience and triumph. By subscribing, you'll never miss an inspiring story like this. Stories that remind us all to stand tall in the face of adversity. Subscribe now and become part of a community that celebrates courage, growth, and the power to overcome.